Hello, I'm Matt Galloway, and this is The Current Podcast.
Well, for politicians, summer is often about glad-handing on the barbecue circuit. But this year, there are a few other things intruding on that agenda. There's a looming deadline for a trade deal with the U.S., the Premier's meeting again on internal trade. And then there's Pierre Poilievre, who has been busy trying to get elected in the Alberta riding of Battle River Crowfoot. To help us unpack all of it, we have convened our panel of political watchers. Kathleen Petty is the host of CBC's West of Centre podcast and Alberta at Noon. Niigaan Sinclair is a columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press and a professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba. And Stephanie Levitz is a senior parliamentary reporter for the Globe and Mail. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Steph, I'm going to start with you and, of course, trade negotiations with the U.S. We've seen this deal over the weekend, or plan for a deal certainly between the U.S. and the EU. Reuters this morning calling it the least worst U.S. trade deal. At the same time, Canada has been downplaying expectations to some extent that there will necessarily be a deal by this August 1st deadline. What's your sense of where things stand right now for Canada?
In some senses, it feels like we're moving towards the least worst option, similar to what's happened with the EU. I think it's been pretty clear from the signaling we've received, not just from the Prime Minister, but from the premiers when he met with them, that the hopes for some arrangement between these two countries that wipes out the new tariffs that Trump has already imposed, the increase that he wants to impose, seems unlikely at best, right? Certainly by the August 1st deadline. And it remains unclear for a lot of Canadians, I think, as to what is actually happening at the negotiating table, which is to say, what are we negotiating? What are we prepared, or what does Trump want from us? What are we prepared to ask for from the Americans beyond getting the tariffs off? So, this August 1st deadline might be a mirage at this point, but maybe they'll find a political oasis and solve this problem after all.
Niigaan, Manitoba's Premier Wab Kinew has been saying that Canada shouldn't rush into a deal. It's better to endure some uncertainty rather than make a bad deal. I mean, Mark Carney has also said, right, only a deal if it's good for Canada. I think in the abstract, folks would agree with that. But when push comes to shove, how much leeway is there to go ahead without a deal on tariffs with the U.S.?
Well, particularly on aluminum and steel, we've got a ticking time bomb for the economy when it comes to the major infrastructure projects that are on the horizon, things that want to move quickly. And if there is a massive issue involving some of the major parts that involve those infrastructure, then we've got a real issue in our hands. As of right now, the economy seems to be withstanding the paranoia that the Trump administration is instilling. But at the same time, I think it's creating a sense of conflict and cacophony within the Canadian economy, within major structure forces rights holders. We're talking about First Nations in just a bit, but it's creating a kind of internal conflict that involves a kind of boogeyman. And I think that's a recipe for disaster. But as of right now, the tariffs don't seem to be creating a major crisis just yet, but there is something on the horizon that certainly we're going to have to deal with.
Kathleen, Niigaan points to the economic considerations amongst the crisis and cacophony, as he said, the chaos. You have a good sense of your finger on the pulse by hosting a daily call-in show in Alberta. What is your sense of how much political flexibility, wiggle room the Prime Minister has here when it comes to holding out for a better agreement, or perhaps going ahead without one?
Well, there's two sort of groups that you're looking at. One is the premiers, and a lot was made about their meeting, which Mark Carney joined, and this sense of unity among all the political leaders. And we'll see how long that lasts. I would argue that's going to be pretty tenuous, depending on what the final deal looks like, assuming that we even get a deal. But on the other half, if you talk to Canadians, and I was talking to Albertans on Thursday, and we had the author of an article in New York Magazine, Simon Van Zylenwood, who wrote an article. First of all, the cover art is amazing. It's a very angry looking, a very big beaver with a chokehold on an American bald eagle. And the headline was, "You have no idea how furious the Canadians are." And so we opened up the phone lines. And we've done this, Catherine, from time to time. But I would say that the resilience and the determination of Canadians to push back and stand up and fight has actually deepened over time rather than dissipated. I thought maybe the determination might fade a little bit over time as people sort of get more nervous about what might be coming now with this new deadline. But from what I heard from Albertans, it was exactly the opposite of dissipation. If anything, they're even more determined. And that's the other audience that Mark Carney is speaking to beyond the premiers. And the premiers obviously have to reflect their constituents.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fascinating question in all of this, too, or one of the many, though, is, you know, when we know what this deal or no deal looks like, Schrodinger's deal or no deal, we still don't know what's in the box here, what the public appetite will be for that. But you point to something else really interesting, Kathleen, that I want to ask you about, which is the way that the premiers are engaging here. Let's listen to Susan Holt, Premier of New Brunswick. She was on The Current just last week following that premiers meeting, and she talked about the confidence in the Prime Minister.
When we look at some of the deals that other countries have signed, well, those aren't deals that we want, and those are worse than what we have now. What you probably saw from the premiers is that we have a lot of confidence in this Prime Minister to be at the table and make those calls about what is in Canada's best interest. And he's been listening to us explain to him what matters most to our provinces, like softwood lumber in New Brunswick's case.
And Kathleen, I mean, it's not just Liberal premiers like Susan Holt. Danielle Smith has been speaking enthusiastically. I interviewed Scott Moe of Saskatchewan on the House just a few weeks ago, and it's striking how enthusiastic they are about the Prime Minister's efforts. How do you make sense of what's going on there?
Well, they have a common enemy, if I can put it that way, right now. So everyone's focused on getting the best deal possible with the U.S. But, you know, the best deal, Catherine, is in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? And so it seems to me that when the rubber hits the road and we start not just hearing yeses to national projects, but no's to national projects, and some of those no's might be sort of backed up by premiers who are opposed to, say, I don't know, pipelines. I do wonder, I hate to be such a cynic, but I do wonder how resilient that unity is going to be.
Yeah, it's a good question. And Steph, I want to bring you in on this because at that premiers meeting, there were the provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario have signed on to this Memorandum of Understanding, an MOU, to push forward on a pipeline, yes, rail, export infrastructure to strengthen the energy and mineral sector. So you have a group of provinces here who say, you know, let's get moving. Maybe we could be on the same side on a pipeline. How significant is that to have these three provinces working together like that?
It is, you know, a truth that the federal government, and personified, let's say, by the Prime Minister, can only do so much when it comes to the diversification of our economy. Yes, you know, there are many people, including the premiers, who would argue that Ottawa over the years has passed legislation that gets in the way. They need to remove these barriers. But some of the onus and the ownership has to rest with provincial leadership itself, right? And so I think what Mr. Carney has really been signaling all along is to, you know, borrow that old movie phrase, help me help you. Right? You guys need to show that you're willing to do this, and then I'll do the things that get Ottawa out of the way. It can't be top down entirely. And so when you have the provinces, I think, picking up on that message and harnessing some of that perhaps momentum we have right now in the national discourse to say, yeah, we do need to do big things differently. Yeah, we do need to get projects going. And perhaps for all these provincial premiers also, there's a bit of a lesson in the Carney, you know, Mr. Carney's election. I mean, he revitalized a moribund Liberal Party on the premise, yes, the counter-Trump premise, but also on this argument that let's just do it already. Let's stop talking. And for provincial premiers, some of whom are, you know, a little ways away from an election, but some of whom are inching ever closer to one, that's what voters are saying they want. I mean, Abacus Data has these new numbers out about what people are looking for in political leadership right now, and it's this can-do attitude. And the premiers need to show that too.
Well, Niigaan, I mean, this is interesting because, yes, folks may very well want a can-do attitude, but then it comes to the question of what precisely it is that they can do, what they want to do. So while you see Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario saying, hey, maybe we could get together on a pipeline, Wab Kinew saying, well, no, that's not necessarily the way we want to go about this, talking about the need to build more consensus with Indigenous communities. I know certainly in the opinion pages of some newspapers in Alberta, the idea that BC and Manitoba might stand in the way of a project is not going over well. What is it like from where you are listening to all of this?
Yeah, I was going to point out there that it's convenient for Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Alberta to get together and start talking about running a pipeline up through Hudson Bay, but they're missing a dance partner in that situation. And just simply declaring that you're going to do something doesn't mean you can actually do it. Premier Canoe in Manitoba has two major constituencies that he, in order to keep his base or to keep a major solid rock of support, that he is very popular. But of course, the first is this kind of burgeoning Canadian unity that is often shaping itself against Trump. That's a very significant part. And if you remember, Premier Canoe and Premier Ford were really the two kind of Captain Canadas when there was the absence of a prime minister after the Trudeau resignation. And then the second is that he, of course, he's got a sort of coalition of environmental groups, union. He is an NDP premier, and then, of course, First Nations. First Nations as a First Nation, the very first First Nations premier of a Canadian province. He has a massive constituency, a lot of political clout when it comes to Manitoba. And of course, he is bringing that force to the premiers, talking about First Nations rights. None of these projects will be able to be employed without First Nations, Inuit, Métis, consultation, consent, free, prior, and informed consent according to the Constitution. We saw the Prime Minister up talking with Inuit people just recently. And of course, the First Nations meeting, which many saw as quite disastrous for the Prime Minister, and particularly kind of this approach that the Prime Minister is taking that is kind of a divide amongst many First Nations, wanting to work with some and not others, and it's created a bit of a stir in most First Nations circles across the country and in Indigenous circles. He had a bit more success with the Inuit, I think, because they're structured in a bit of a different way. And so what you've got Premier Canoe, who is reminding the premiers that you have to work with First Nations legally, constitutionally, and then you have premiers who are saying, no, we got to get this done. And it's always created a situation of the argument, which has always been used with Indigenous peoples in the past, which is, we have to do this now, it's an emergency, we have to do it yesterday. And First Nations just hear it over and over and over again. It's just a tired old argument because, yes, it may be an unprecedented time, but the argument that it is constantly an emergency is always thrown against Indigenous peoples, and it's just not very convincing.
I'm going to jump in here, Niigaan, because specifically to that point, we have a little piece of tape from the meeting that the Prime Minister held with First Nations rights holders in particular in Gatineau a couple of weeks back. And here is Ovid McCurdy, the former Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, raising some of the concerns at that meeting.
I was hoping to learn from the government what the emergency is, what the crisis is for Canada. I didn't hear that.
So it speaks exactly to the point you were making, Niigaan, right? He didn't hear what the crisis was that required all of this. It was obvious. I attended that meeting. I was covering it, and there was a difference of opinion, a range of opinions, let's say, in terms of how much trust there is moving forward with the federal government. Do you think the Prime Minister has enough trust from some First Nations leaders to go ahead with some of these projects, or do you think that he has to ask himself whether his agenda is really in trouble if he doesn't make some big changes?
Well, I'll be totally clear. Indigenous peoples en masse, and it's hard ever to make any statement about Indigenous peoples en masse. But as both an Indigenous person myself, working with Indigenous communities, as a person who writes about Indigenous issues for my livelihood, I can tell you that everyone I speak to understands this is an unprecedented time, understands that there is an unprecedented moment with the U.S. president creating a sense of chaos globally. Everyone understands that. But what they don't understand is why Canada has suddenly decided that they're going to focus on what they claim to be, or what the Prime Minister is claiming to be, is this will be adequate consultation, just trust us. And although we will move at unprecedented speeds, we're going to deal with a 150-year-old problem of mistreating, marginalizing, leaving First Nations, Inuit, Métis people out of the economic equation of the country in a weekend. It's a very unconvincing argument. It doesn't deal with a lot of the issues of trust. And as you heard with former National Chief Ovid McCurdy, it's not very convincing to do this. What is more convincing is to work at the speed in which is necessary within areas, and en masse work with First Nations instead of imposing an advisory council to speak on behalf of everybody. I can get into the nuts and bolts of C5 if you want and the problems with that. But I would just say that Mark Carney has the most friendliest Indigenous leadership he perhaps can ever have. Many of the leaders of national organizations are former Liberals themselves, but it seems to be that he wants to work with certain geographical areas, which would probably be the path of least resistance, but will also create the most amount of conflict amongst Indigenous groups.
Okay. It's certainly going to be a file to watch. We do want to squeeze a conversation in here about Pierre Poilievre's by-election as well. So Kathleen, I will bring you in because Pierre Poilievre's been out campaigning in Battle River, Crowfoot. What is your sense of how things are going for him out there as he tries to regain a seat in the House of Commons after losing his own Ottawa seat?
Well, I'll start by saying it gets ever more interesting. There is a forum/debate in Camrose tomorrow. There are 10 candidates who are going to be a part of that. The Camrose Chamber of Commerce is organizing it, but they won't release the names of the people participating. They capped it at 10. As we know, there's over 200 candidates, so I can appreciate why they would cap it. So our expectation, what everyone is wondering, is will Pierre Poilievre be among the 10? Because won't that be interesting to watch? Mm-hmm. And we, of course, will be covering that. And there will be a live stream if people want to check it out. But in addition to that, I mean, no one is seriously questioning whether Pierre Poilievre can win this by-election. As we know, Damien Carrick won it with, about 83% of the vote. I think there was one riding where Conservatives won with 84 in Saskatchewan, but, we can safely say it's a safe seat. But having said that, what's going to be interesting is what the members define as a win. Now, obviously, 50% plus one is a win. But in terms of his political future and how he's viewed by the membership of the Conservative Party, how close does he have to be to 83%? How close does he have to be to that kind of win? And the extent to which fingers will be pointed at this long ballot initiative and how that might affect whatever result he ends up with.
Steph, I want to bring you in on this as just a closing thought. It looks like there's now going to be more than 200 candidates, as Kathleen was saying, 209 that had registered to run as of last night, part of this longest ballot process. Poilievre's been pushing back on that. He's called it a scam. The Conservatives are calling for a change in the law so that it's harder for folks to run, that there would be more signatures needed, not allowing people to nominate more than one candidate. Is this a legitimate issue for Pierre Poilievre, or is this about maybe sort of muddying the waters in terms of what that final result percentage looks like for him?
I mean, it's certainly going to mean that everyone's going to have to wait up very, very late to see how much of a percentage Pierre Poilievre gets in this by-election. The longest ballot, they're trying to make a political argument that members of parliament should not be the ones in charge of electoral reform because it's too much of a conflict of interest. Does this protest make that point? I don't know that it does. It just ends up being covered as more of like an irritant to the democratic process. Mm-hmm. Maybe, I think for Mr. Poilievre, it's a tricky one because he would like to be ostensibly campaigning on issue sets, right? And instead he's talking about this top line issue of electoral reform and democratic processes, which people tend to tune out. I don't know if it matters, I guess is the point in the end. It's noisy. It makes noise around this by-election. It will mean a late night for the ballot counters. It'll probably mean some questions going forward for the Prime Minister and others about, do we want to have a national conversation about whether this is okay? Should we change any rules? And again, I go back to that's exactly what has happened now. It's noise around a bigger story about Mr. Poilievre's future as leader of the Conservative Party. Okay. Well, listen, noise, but noise to listen to. There's a lot going on. Thank you all for your thoughts today. Appreciate it. Kathleen Petty is the host of CBC's West of Centre podcast in Alberta at noon. Niigaan Sinclair is a columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press and a professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba. And Stephanie Levitz is a senior parliamentary reporter for the Globe and Mail.
You've been listening to The Current Podcast. My name is Matt Galloway. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you soon.